All right, the recording has started. Before we get rolling here, I just want to give everyone a little bit of a reminder. Keep your line muted, your video off. Type any questions you have into the chat or wait until the question and answer session to unmute your line. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, is the host of today's webinar, and I am Abigail Appelman. I'll be moderating. So as we get rolling here, feel free to tell us just a little bit about who you are in the chat. And with that, I would like to invite Denise Coleman, our state conservationist, to give a welcome.
Good morning, Abigail, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating today in the Urban Pollinator and Beneficial Insects webinar. Our very own Jim Gillis, who's our state biologist, will be presenting along with friends from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Xerces Society, and the Farm Service Agency. So we're really pleased you came on today. We certainly want to open this up to ask questions as the presenters, as the speakers speak. So please type your questions in the chat and we'll get started. Thanks, Abigail.
Thank you, Denise. And with that, I would like to have first up Cass Urban Mead from Xerces Society. Cass is the pollinator conservation specialist. And Cass, I'd like to invite you to give a robust introduction of yourself and go ahead and share your screen when you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can you hear and see me while I work on getting my screen going here?
Yes, you are on camera and we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So glad to hear it. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here today. Let's see if this will share. Is that looking right?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, Abigail and Denise, and to the other presenters today. Yeah, so my name is Cass Urban Mead, short for Catherine, which might be what you're seeing on my official name there. So either is fine. And I am a partner biologist with the Xerces Society and also with the USDA NRCS. And I'm just going to jump right in and start to talk about Xerces. And we got a lot of really great questions from everybody who's registered today, and I've tried to incorporate as many of those into kind of the material on beneficial insects in urban areas as possible. But please, jump in the chat or in the question and answer if I haven't gotten to your comment later. Yeah, and I am responsible for the kind of the broader Mid-Atlantic region, but I am actually living in Philadelphia. I'm in South Philly, so if I haven't met you yet, I'm new, I'm onboarding, getting settled, so I'm really excited to meet you if we haven't met yet, and I hope to work together. All right, so about the Xerces Society. We are an invertebrate conservation nonprofit, although we do have kind of a strong emphasis on pollinators and beneficial insects. We're named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which is one of the first butterflies known to go extinct due to human expansion and habitat loss. So we're an international nonprofit founded in 1971 and have been growing. And a lot of our work is we try to have all of our work be grounded in science and evidence-based policies and interventions, but to do really close and careful work with land managers, with educators, with farmers and community members to make sure that the interventions and projects that we do make sense for the location on the ground in order to make meaningful long-term conservation a reality. Yeah, so I'm on the pollinator team primarily. That includes other beneficial insects because as we'll talk about, so many of the plants that host our really wonderful and diverse pollinators are also good for supporting predators and beneficial insects. We have a lot of folks who also work in endangered species. We have a team on mussels and fireflies, aquatic invertebrates, pesticide protection, integrated pest management. And then some projects on Bee City and Bee Campus and community science. So if you're interested in any of those other directions, I will put resources to our website and other links at the end. I just want to give you a sense of the context that I'm coming from. Yeah, and so as I said, I'm also an NRCS partner biologist. Many of us in Xerces are. This is a longstanding relationship where if you're hoping to do some of these NRCS programs, like Abigail and others in this group have been organizing so many wonderful talks to kind of introduce those programs. You can, when you're working with your NRCS office, if there is a pollinator specific project that you're interested in many cases, they will reach out to me or another Xerces partner for that technical support as part of your planning to get an NRCS program or cost share program on the ground. So you start by going to your NRCS person, and then if it makes sense, they'll loop us in. So that's just another way besides directly reaching out to Xerces that you can get that technical support. And again, Jim and others are going to talk more about this at length, but I just wanted to highlight that even though a lot of the work maybe from NRCS and Xerces historically has been on larger habitats or big farms, there are increasingly resources specifically geared towards smaller and urban sites. So when I dive into bee biology in a moment, I just wanted you to know that we are thinking about the ways that this intersects with actionable and cost share programs. For example, pollinator mix on urban sites. You don't need to worry about these numbers. This is just to give you the gist. Multi-species cover crop at the 1,000 square foot scale, small scale urban field border, or specialty crop rotations for the urban or small scale. Yeah, lots of great ways to collaborate and to work together at this interface. Okay, so who are our insects? Why do we care? Why do we want to do cost share and programs to intervene about them? I don't really think you can overstate the degree to which this quote at the top feels right. The fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. The number of insects, both by biomass and number, who are pests who bother us is just absolutely minuscule relative to the number who provide these other benefits, such as soil health, pest control, crop pollination, pollination that relates both to wildflowers as well as to so many of our nutrient-dense and dietarily important foods, and connects directly to higher yields. They're also the base of really important food chains for so many animals that we rely on, both just because we're all a part of this world and for their ecosystem services. So yeah, insects are absolutely incredible, and so often we overlook the ways that our lives are dependent on them. Unfortunately, pollinators and many insects broadly, even though we don't have good data on all of them because we haven't always been paying attention in a formal way, but the ones we know really are experiencing alarming and rapid declines. So we know that at least 28% of our bumblebees are threatened. The rusty-patched bumblebee you may have heard of is now on the endangered species list. Over 17% of North American butterflies are at risk. And in the East, the monarch butterfly populations, and I know we'll get some more conversation about monarch later, super exciting, has declined, I think 90% since the 1990s. And so it's important that we are thinking about all the ways that we can work to conserve and support and bolster the populations that we still have, and think about ways to live going forward with better insect care. So I'm gonna focus on pollinators, and many of this does apply to other beneficial insects too. So that can seem bleak. 2022, it's been a lot of bad news. And one thing that I really love about insects is that they are so small. And in many cases, although their habitat needs may seem complex at first glance, you really can provide a lot of those resources on a very small scale. So that means even here in South Philly, where I'm living, if you've been to this neighborhood, there's not a lot of trees everywhere. I've been able to find some really cool bees on a small patio that's a concrete pad with just some plants. So we have a lot more power than you think. It's not too late for a lot of these insects. So yeah, even small spaces can meaningfully contribute to species conservation, and these really beautiful and amazing and important insects are a great avenue to do so. All right, so understanding pollinator diversity. Usually when we think about bees as just, the big picture, the first thing that pops into most people's minds is the European honeybee. And European honeybees are great. They are European. They arrived in 1622 with the colonists and rapidly spread westward. And much like chickens, much like cows, they are livestock that we have meaningful and important relationships with. They're a great hobby. They're a great thing to do for themselves, but they are best thought of as a livestock who is not at risk of extinction. Even though there are disease problems and some colonies that have crashed, they are not a wild animal at risk. So I do think that putting them in that bucket with, like, we have reasons we love chickens and eggs and cows and milk, similarly honeybees and honey. But when we're thinking about our wild populations, who are so good at pollinating many of our crops and have these long, intimate evolutionary relationships with so many of our wildflowers, there's actually over 4,000 other species of them in the United States, and over 5,000 on the continent. And they come in all shapes and sizes. Many of them nest in really small crevices or in little holes in the sandy soil where you've never even noticed them if you didn't know to look, including in vacant lots, including in pots on a balcony, including in community gardens. And most of these native bees are actually solitary. So they also are very gentle because of that. They don't have a hive they're protecting, so they don't have any sort of sacrificial attack the large mammal instinct to go chase after you. But they're just busily going about collecting as much pollen as they can to create brood for their next generation, food for their next generation. All right. And so whether you're in a pocket park or a pasture, pollinator habitat needs to provide food for these pollinators. Many of them can actually choose the pollens that they want or only use certain flowers or certain species. And so it's important to have that diversity. They also need shelter, nest sites, overwintering sites. We'll talk a little bit more about ways to think about winter in a few moments. Protection from pesticide risk. Contaminated soil sometimes can express in pollen and nectar. So you want to think about if you want to be doing container gardening, if you know that the soil is contaminated. And also to consider, again, each stage of life, whether that's a butterfly who you know their larvae needs to develop on a specific type of grass, or a bee who needs a certain type of plant stem in order to nest inside of. And as I've said, you don't need large acres to make a difference. And so now let's dive in to some of the different ways that a small habitat can meet multiple needs. So there's lots of reasons that we have relationships with lots of food plants or other non-native plants, and many of those are really important, and we should grow those for those other benefits they provide. And when we're also thinking about supporting the native wild pollinators from the region, many of them can only recognize or know how to live or can digest the pollen, nectar, or leaves from a native or naturalized species. And so we want to really think about combining all of those things in one place. Also, we don't want to plant aggressive plants, right? So Canada goldenrod, fantastic bee plant, fantastic for a meadow, probably not the right late season aster for a small lot, right? Because it could spread and take over. But I said late season, so that's part of this next really big important thing is to think about a range of bloom times from spring to fall. Lots of wild bees are out in the spring, others come out in the summer, others come out only in the fall, whereas, familiar bees like the bumblebee is out all year long. So we need to make sure that we have food all time of year. And in small spaces, like this cool community plot, they allowed this kind of fun looking stump to hang around as a nesting feature. And you want places to sit, places where people have shade, right, to all fit together. Plant selection. We have a ton of plant lists and resources and other connections to local nurseries and places to source plants. Thinking about native perennial plants that will come back year after year to allow a population to rely on them. Not all plants are created equal, as we've mentioned, so you want plants that have high pollinator value, and we have some great guides that talk about how to pick early, middle, and late season plants with those resources. You want to include butterfly host plants, including grasses, where specialized butterflies often have only a couple types of grasses that their larvae can develop on. So the more of those, the more different butterflies we can have. And our lists are also tailored. There's many great resources, but the ones we'll put later for your reference also include ones that are more likely to be able to be found at a local nursery and are likely to thrive and have some indicators about which types of soil they can establish on, or are likely to be successful when you grow them. Obviously, lots of other great native or more endangered plants are great, but we're not going to put those on our list to send to everybody because they're really hard to find, right? So definitely keep those and support them if you have them. And again, when you go to the nursery or the store to ask for these, you want to ask if they can be guaranteed to be pesticide free. All right. So one really cool question that I got from a couple people in the pre-registration had to do with habitat connectivity. And I want to think about that when we're thinking about a small space. So, you know, this photograph is gorgeous and is bigger than a lot of spaces even that I see, or maybe the total size that you see, maybe without those trees, right? And when we do meadows in big open rural areas, we often have 20 species mixes. But in a small space, especially if you think a bee might be flying around looking for some food to eat, or a butterfly is looking for a resource, it's actually better to choose a couple really good plants and then put them in clumps of 2 to 5 so that you get a big showy display. And then they can find those more easily. So for example, you could, you know, have your bee balm or your liatris or your mountain mint in 3 different clumps, and then have 2 or 3 clumps of grasses and sedges. And those could be in containers or in a lot, right? And then think about how that connects to maybe there's street trees who bloom early and maybe those bloom mid-season. And then together you've created that succession of bloom, right? Rather than trying to have one of every single meadow plant in one tiny little patio, right? It's more about thinking about that landscape scale of connecting all those pieces to make sure you have the full season. And when you're in this last bullet point, when you're picking those plants, locally sourced, open pollinated seed grown plants are ideal because those bring that genetic diversity that allow for resilience in the face of lots of different weather or hot seasonality, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so this kind of expands on that idea. When you're thinking about designing your site, think about how your neighborhood can meet multiple pollinator needs. So the forage across the year, straight trees are a big source of early season and sometimes mid-season resources. Are there sources of nesting nearby? Is there a rain garden where you could work with your community to enhance certain types of species? Highlighting smart landscaping, many native species that are hosts for insects are also those that are really great for storm surge or weather protection. So in terms of thinking about city level zoning or climate planning, incorporating pollinators is a really synergistic concept there. Sidewalk strips, even though each one can be narrow, together they can make a lot of habitat. In a community garden, think about where you can add stumps or have some posts of dead wood or a rock pile. And those are little crevices and habitats where bees can overwinter or can sleep. All right, so I know that I just have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to skip past season-long bloom here and highlight just a couple more nest sites, because I think that those are maybe less well known. Again, coordinate with other gardens. Cool. So many bees will nest in the pithy, hollow stems of raspberries, of many of the flowers. If when you snip them off, there's kind of a hole in the middle. There's many both beneficial wasps who are non-aggressive but will lay eggs in your caterpillars to help control pests, as well as these small carpenter bees, leafcutter bees will nest inside the stems. So you want to leave those up over the winter. And if you do any cleanup, you know, please leave them either in place or leave them intact somewhere out of the way. Ideally up though. This is one of my absolute favorite bees. This one is all over the city, super gentle, going about her pollinating business, collecting pollen, and they nest in logs. I've seen them zipping in and out of the back of benches and small pocket parks. So that's a really cool thing to know. And again, remember, they're super gentle. They don't have big hives. They don't have an aggressive instinct at all. And they're very beautiful. Keep an eye out for this one this spring. And leaves. So fireflies, predator beetles, butterflies, moths, and bumblebees really love nesting at the base of grass tussocks covered in leaves. So obviously there are places where we need to keep grass. But if you're going to move those leaves at all, if you can't leave them where they are, try to think about where you can use them as mulch, where you can keep them on site, pile them around vegetation, and think about all those tiny little insects who are overwintering wrapped in leaves or in the soil underneath them, using that temperature and physical protection to make it through the winter. So leave the leaves. Lawn conversion, this is pretty straightforward. Obviously, there are reasons that lawn is sometimes a really good thing, although maybe we could enhance it with some ground cover or some clovers. But if there's edges or areas where you're really just mowing and using gas and, fixing that lawnmower every year, think about how we can convert this grass, which basically has the ecological value of a parking lot, into flowering shrubs, into nest structure, into habitat. This is a silly picture we put up sometimes. That's, the lawn is a legacy of old European landscaping values that I think we can break free of. And another thing to think about when you go to the nursery and ask, hey, can you guarantee that this wasn't pre-treated with insecticides? Also look out for these kind of overly ornamental plants who have been selected for really funky flower shapes or colors, because many times that means that the insects who have evolved on this continent don't know how to recognize them anymore. And in other cases, they may not even actually offer pollen and nectar anymore. So a great way to do that, honestly, is just to also go to the garden center on a beautiful sunny day and see, are there actually any insects visiting it? And that's often a great strategy. But yeah, the closer to the wild type, the more likely the insects are still able to understand those as a partner for their food or pollen nectar needs. All right, we have some great systems for Bee City and Bee Campus. If you want to get together with the group, depending on the structure of your neighborhood, or if you're in a campus, and you can get certified to kind of take a look at all the ways that municipal pesticides may be applied, minimize or reduce those to the extent you can. Think about habitat connectivity, and we have some programs and folks who work on that. Also, if you are in the city of Philadelphia or New Jersey, that's constrained by our grants this year that provided the funding for this, but we hope to expand it in future years. We have an application interest form open that I'll throw in the chat shortly, and we'll be looking for project partners to receive a couple hundred free plants. And the interest form is just kind of tell us about your selected your installation plan, your irrigation plan, how you can protect the plants from any rodents or deer, et cetera. And we'll notify partners to receive these free plants by mid-May, with pickup at Pinelands Nursery in June. And I'll throw that link in the chat in just a moment. I just can't see it quite this second, but I'll do that. And I think that's pretty much it. We have lots more resources available on our website, including classroom series, the X Kids, Invertebrates for Youth, workbooks in Spanish and English, lots of community science programs, and resources on specific pollinators and agricultural and specific resources. A lot of things here. We are a donor-supported organization, so if you're inspired, please become a member. And with that, I hope that this was useful and interesting. Please tell me what I missed, and I look forward to working together and continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Cass. That was fantastic. And I know we have some folks joining us that may not come from an agricultural background, but you really brought it together with these themes of livestock and wildlife. You presented to us food and habitat. And I really liked that image that you showed us about breaking that lawn legacy cycle, and really utilizing that space for pollinator habitat. We
Very
have
cool.
time for a question or two from the chat. And
Sure.
as I kind of cue that up, I want to point out that Kelly Gill is also here from Xerxes Society today. And so as your questions are coming into the chat, you may hear from Cass, or you might also hear from Kelly, and certainly our other presenters may be contributing to any answers that are typed into the chat as well. So the question that I see right now is, when when is it safe to remove leaves in the spring to maximize pollinator winter habitat while not limiting early spring plant growth?
Yeah, this is a really great question that we get a lot. Um, so you hear kind of different recommendations. The safest and kind of, if you want a rule of thumb, folks often say think about when the soil has been 50 degrees, so not the air but the soil. You can just stick a thermometer in there for about a couple weeks, maybe a week or so. And that's really to kind of to protect that first flush of spring insects who are going to come out. But unfortunately, there are insects that will emerge throughout the entire season. So that's kind of like your first line of defense to protect the first round. But the more that you can either just move anything, if you're really trying to plant somewhere and you can sneak in, your plants just and leave the litter, or if you can leave the stems standing and let your perennials come up underneath them. If they're perennial plants, they know how to grow even with those stems standing. Um, but yeah, so try and wait at least till it's been 50 degrees of soil temperature to allow for that first wave of emergence. But the more you can leave kind of wild and messy looking, the longer, the more waves of different groups of insects who come out later in the spring you'll protect. And if you really need to cut things down or move them, think about, is there a place where you can leave them kind of undamaged at the back of the property or, the corner, wherever it is.
Thanks,
And
Cass.
actually, if I could just jump in on that messy idea, sometimes if you have like a messier lawn, it can be helpful to have a sign or a little mowed border, especially in areas where people may not know, to think about pollinator conservation as your first thing. Sometimes just telling people, hey, this is what we're doing is enough to help that kind of messiness be acceptable. Yeah.
That's terrific. Thanks, Cass.
Mhm.
We have time for one or two more questions. The next one I see is, will the slides or recording be available? And the answer to that is yes. The slides and the recording will be available, and they'll be posted to our NRCS in Pennsylvania Urban Ag website. And a link will go out to that after the presentation, as long as you're on the registration list, uh, or get in touch with me if you don't see it. We're going to take one more question and we're going to save the rest. Please, Cass, feel free to respond in the chat box after this. Does it matter if nesting areas are put in the sun or the shade?
If Cool question. If you have limited area, better to have them than not. But if you're thinking of like a log or like a big, maybe untreated wooden bench that you want to, support um, as like a nesting habitat, usually there is more activity of insects in the sun. They tend to just be a little bit more pathogen free with that kind of cleansing sunshine. And because also insects mostly can't generate their own heat, that warmth is really helpful. But if you have limited area, it's also great to put those in the shade. And for overwintering for bumblebee queens, for example, they're often on a sloped bank or in a wood pile or under a leafier wood pile, and those can be in the shade, no problem. So so better late than never. But if you're choosing, maybe bias towards sun. Yep.
Thanks, Cass. There
Yeah.
are a couple more questions in the chat box. We're going to save those till later, so feel free to respond to those, Cass, by typing in the chat. We will get those on the recording, so I will be speaking those aloud at the end during the full question and answer session. Next up, we have Jim Gillis, and Jim comes to us from our own NRCS. He is our state biologist, and Jim is going to be speaking specifically to urban farmers and growers, agricultural producers, because NRCS has both technical and financial assistance available. So go ahead, Jim.
Okay, give me one moment here. I'm trying to get my screen to share as quickly and efficiently as possible. I do have a little bit of an issue with my internet support today, so please bear with me. Can you guys see that?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try again. apologize. I am, it is not cooperating. Abigail, if you want to bounce to someone else, I'll see if I can work some remedies out here and try to get everything set up for the next time slot.
Okay, no problem. We're going to move on then to Melissa Wiebrick with FSA. And again, Melissa has a presentation focused toward agricultural producers from the Farm Service Agency. And Melissa is our outreach coordinator over at FSA. And I'll let you take it away, Melissa.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I am Melissa Wiebrick, and I work for the Pennsylvania State Farm Service Agency, and I have a presentation to share as well. Okay, and can you still see my face, or is it only the screen?
We can see both.
Okay, thank you for that. So I titled the presentation today Urban Buzz. So I would like to talk about access to capital programs and some record establishments. And the Farm Service Agency is helpful to American farmers, ranchers, and landowners, and it makes investments or improvements in, the ag operations and assists producers in recovering from impacts of things like natural disasters and market fluctuations. And FSA offers a variety of disaster assistance. Farm loan, safety net programs, conservation programs. It's about supporting rural prosperity and helping ensure safe, affordable, and abundant food supply. Um, so, amid good times and challenging times, the FSA staff at the service centers across Pennsylvania are available and able to help producers. So that's what FSA, Farm Service Agency, is about. And today's agenda, I would like to highlight 5 programs that I feel would be of most use for this audience to know about. And the first one I'd like to mention is the Farm Loan Program. And we speak in acronyms, so that's abbreviated FLP. The Farm Storage Facility Loans, and that's FSFL. The Non-Insured Disaster Assistance Program, and that's NAP. Marketing Assistance Loans, MALs. And Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish Program, and that's ELAP. So the first program that I mentioned is Farm Loan Programs, and that offers direct and guaranteed loans to farmers and ranchers to promote, build, and sustain family farms for a thriving ag economy. And some of the highlights that the loans offer through Farm Service Agency are microloans, youth loans, emergency loans, loans for beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers, also, farm ownership loans, which may be used to purchase farms, enlarge existing farms, construct new buildings, improve structures, pay closing costs, promote soil and water conservation and protection. And the loan max on those loans are $600,000. And then farm operating loans are available. They are typically used for normal operating expenses, machinery and equipment, minor real estate repairs or improvements, and possibly refinancing debt. And the loan max on that is $400,000. Just a quick overview of some of the interest rates, which are typically pretty appealing. That's for the month of April and the different loan program names. Moving right along, Farm Storage Facility Loan Program. So the Farm Storage Facility Loan Program provides low interest financing for things like equipment and structure that would be needed to store, handle, or transport, in this case, honey. Examples of eligible equipment could be the following. So storage buildings for honey that's harvested, equipment to maintain or monitor the quality of the stored honey, portable storage containers essential to proper storage of honey. Could be bulk tanks suitable for storing honey, bottler system for honey, maybe even equipment for moving honey, like a forklift or hand truck. And it is noted that processing equipment like your packing containers or storage space for bees or hives aren't included in this particular loan. Forward moving, NAP, which is Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, is something to note. It's financial assistance when producers have a non-insured crop. and we're talking about honey. So when low yields or crop losses or prevented planting occur due to natural disasters, that's when this program would be of interest to have. So eligible honey includes table or non-table honey produced commercially for human consumption. Producers must apply for coverage and pay the service fee by application closing dates. And producers must timely file reports like their colonies and then reports like their production records, which would be the pounds of honey produced per colony of bees for that crop year. And marketing assistance loans are something to highlight, notated as MALs. So a commodity loan, a marketing assistance loan, provides producers interim financing to allow selling of their product, in this case honey, when conditions are more favorable or profitable. So honey is the eligible from eligible floral sources, and meeting the FSA storage requirements could be pledged as security. It would be held in the storage and then be able to be sold at a more marketable time frame. This is just a quick overview that the loan rate on honey is 69 cents a pound during this 22 crop year. Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish program known as ELAP. It's an emergency assistance program that covers colony losses, honeybee hive losses, and honeybee feed losses in instances where they've been destroyed by an eligible natural disaster or caused by colony collapse disorder. And this includes things like bees that are housed in a managed hive or used for honey production, pollination, or honeybee breeding. And it doesn't include wild feral honeybees, leafcutter bees, or other bee species that are not used to produce honey, pollinating, or breeding honeybees. So I say all these things, and folks listening might say, well, what do I need to do next? So the first thing that I would advise is to communicate with your local county office and establish your farm records. The local staff there can assist you with this, and I will alert you that you would need to be prepared with some type of association with the land that you're farming or where you're headquartered. So that could be like a lease, it could be a deed, or some type of documentation supporting the attachment of your operation to that area. You find your local FSA office by going to farmers.gov, and there's a locator called the Service Center Locator, and you can just type in your information to find your local service center. There's also a map of Pennsylvania, and I know it's small, but that has some of the highlights of where the local offices are. I also suggest, if you can, to subscribe for the FSA newsletters. And that's done through the website that's on the screen. The image will be farmers.gov, and what you'll do is select your state and county, and then you can click the topics that you'd be interested in and click submit. So those are typically sent monthly. There is also opportunity for texting alerts, and that can keep you aware of any programs or news that would be of interest. So lastly, I share the websites fsa.usda.gov or farmers.gov for more information way deeper than what I've overviewed, of course. And then some of the social media channels are also linked just for further options and information to check out. So that's what I have today. I'd love to entertain questions, or if I need to give the time back so that we can do at the end, that would be totally okay as well. So I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope that if your interest is piqued in any of the programs that I mentioned, that you'll reach out and we can start some of those relationships to have that established. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for handing back the time for Q&A for your presentation. We will save that until the end to keep things rolling along here. And I believe, Jim, you may have things figured out there. Is it going to work to share your screen at this point?
I hope so. I hope so. Let's try and see what it does. Okay, is anybody seeing that just yet?
Yes, I can see your PowerPoint now.
Okay, excellent. I am not going to turn There we go. I'm not going to turn my camera on because I don't want to overload the system that I have. But for those of you who haven't met me yet, I can assure you you're not missing anything if you don't get to see me in person. So I'm going to cover the NRCS side of some of our urban pollinator work that can be done. I have kept my presentation relatively short compared to some of the others today, simply because a lot of the technical information that we would provide is exactly the same as what Cass went over. We also provide some financial assistance, which is different from what we just covered with FSA, and that's what I'm going to touch on briefly is the types of assistance that we can provide. Obviously, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll try to cover them as best I can toward the end. So NRCS does support urban pollinator projects right alongside our normal support for urban farming projects. The two go hand in hand, and usually the pollinator aspect of it actually falls within the urban farming aspect. Sort of think of it as we're offering pollinator projects to further the germination and the production of the vegetable or fruit crops in the urban farming operation. So we can provide two different types of help to urban farmers. So if folks are interested in pollinator conservation specifically, well, we can provide some technical assistance, which falls under the category of practical know-how and experience with a lot of these questions, very similar to what Cass was already covering from the Xerces Society. And in fact, Cass mentioned that Xerces and NRCS partner up quite a bit, and we can substitute for one another. We can cooperate together on particular sites and things like that. So at some point, it's very similar as far as what the two groups can provide, and we tend to try to complement one another. We also cooperate pretty heavily with Penn State University, and between the three agencies, we've developed quite a bit of information that's publicly available and can be used to assess your habitat potential for your site, provide some seed lists and plant lists and suggestions like that, very similar to what Cass already described. Where we do break a little bit from the other groups is that we can also provide financial assistance. The EQIP program, which stands for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, offers incentive payments that can help offset the cost of adopting pollinator practices and really adopting those urban farming practices in general. The practice payments that we offer are repayments. So they don't necessarily pay for a practice up front, but what we will do is repay or cost share the cost of that practice upon installation. We usually try to cover at least 75% of the installation costs, but that varies from place to place and from practice to practice. But that is our goal, is at least 75% of a project cost. Some of the things that we can do that help to provide pollinator benefits, and these are the practice names that they're listed under. And I would suggest that you don't get hung up on these names. It's the activities that the practices do that are of the most interest. So we can actually do specific habitat plantings for pollinators under the wildlife habitat planting. And just like Cass said, I want to point out that pollinators are wildlife. They're just smaller than usual. You know, when we say wildlife, we tend to think of birds and mammals and things like that. But actually, wild bees are a very important part of our ecosystems as well. Cover crops are another thing that NRCS can help with, both technically and financially. And it's important to realize that a cover crop doesn't have to be a 20-acre field. Cover crops provide a lot of benefits even to smaller raised beds, such as the two pictured in the middle of the screen here. And the type of cover crop that's used can also be very beneficial depending on what your next crop is going to be. So here we see buckwheat and a mix with clovers. Both clovers and buckwheat are excellent cover crops, but they're also excellent for pollinators. So it's kind of a two birds with one stone approach for a lot of that. And then the other four practices listed at the bottom are things that we can definitely help with, but may not apply to all of the urban settings. Things like windbreaks, hedgerows, field borders, riparian buffers if you have a water body near your project or part of your project. Those are all available too, and those can all be tailored to have pollinator benefits. It's just that they may not be as universally available as the two above. So how can someone get help from NRCS, whether they're interested in the financial or the technical assistance when they want to begin their pollinator conservation? That's actually fairly simple. All you have to do is ask for it at your county office. Now, some of the areas that we're looking at today, such as Philadelphia, you may not have an office right in Philadelphia County, but you are actually available to an office next door. Or something like that. And very similar to what we saw for FSA, there are lists of locations available on the internet, or you can look in the local phone books, anything like that. You'll be able to find us with no problem. And most counties do have their own local office, and it's just a matter of going there. And those offices are often shared between NRCS and FSA, so you can make a one-stop shop as far as that goes. You can talk with both agencies at the same time in person, as long as you're meeting the COVID restrictions at this point. And those are going to be changing, so keep an ear to the ground for that one. But the idea here is to, if you're interested in our help, all you have to do is ask for it. It is free for both the technical assistance, and then you can be considered for financial assistance with no commitment other than completing paperwork. One thing I would suggest is if you're going to apply to us for assistance, whether it's financial or technical, please start by describing your location and your goals. Don't go straight to the comment, something like, I heard you offer money for urban projects or something like that, because a lot of times that doesn't connect the dots for our folks when you're talking to them, and they may not be aware of all the funding that's available for urban projects. Instead, it works if you emphasize your farming goals rather than specific programs. This does a couple things. This keeps you from having to remember the name of the programs, and it opens our staff up to being able to match you to whatever funding is available at that time, regardless of a specific program name. So rather than saying, I heard you offer money for urban projects, a better approach would be to come in and say, we have an urban farming project in Philadelphia or in Scranton or wherever, and we're interested in NRCS assistance with blank. And you can fill in the blank for yourself with something like a high tunnel, irrigation, a pollinator planting, and so on. I can guarantee that you will get more assistance with that second approach than you would with the first. And more importantly, you'll be casting a wider net for the types of assistance that you'll be able to get. So please keep that in mind. And with that, I apologize again. I sort of rushed through this, but I was trying to get us caught up after my earlier technical issues. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take those now.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that so much. And certainly, as Jim said, we have staff ready to come out and take a look at your site if you would like to invite us. It is important to make that first ask, though, because typically people don't come out unless you've contacted us first. Jim, I see 0 questions in the chat at this point for you, and I would kind of like to roll right into Nicole's presentation with an eye on the time here. We will be taking Q&A at the end, even if we run past 1 o'clock, so folks feel free to stay on the line. Nicole comes to us from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she has a presentation about monarchs. This morning, she is an endangered species biologist. Nicole, would you like to take it?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my slides on the screen. Sorry. Can you see my presentation now?
We can see it. That's no problem. Yep.
Okay. All right. Let me turn my camera on. All right. So can you see me?
We can see you and your slides. Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I'm Nicole Rinaldi, one of the endangered species biologists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Pennsylvania field office located in State College. Out of our office, we provide guidance on avoiding impacts to currently listed species, and we also work with other agencies to proactively manage at-risk species to help keep those species off the list. Now, I know monarchs have been in the news a lot, and you probably have seen lots of news articles and different resources concerning monarchs, but I hope I can give you some additional information about them where you would be able to help contribute to their conservation. Okay, so in a 2020 listing decision, it was determined that the species does warrant protection under the Endangered Species Act, but the listing is precluded by higher priority actions. So that basically makes the monarch what we consider a candidate species, which means it does not have statutory protections, but we encourage partners to help conserve the species. The whole species was assessed for protection, but for this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the Eastern North American population. This population has adaptations that make it particularly unique. For one, the Eastern and the Western North American populations are the ancestral origin for the species. They undergo long-distance migration every year, and they undergo something called reproductive diapause, which is a halt in reproduction in order to migrate. They are larger bodied and larger winged than the non-migratory monarchs, and it is the population with the most individuals. Wintering populations in Mexico are measured each December by delineating the area monarchs are roosting in hectares. From there, you can estimate the number of monarchs. So based on this estimate, the largest population estimate was in the 96-97 year. As you can see, we were at roughly 380 million butterflies. And then if you notice, there's a pretty steady decline. And in the 2013-14 year, there was an estimate of only 14 million monarchs, which is a huge drop. So as you can see, as I mentioned, it's an overall downward trend. And from this diagram, you can see that there are 4 stages to monarchs. There's the egg, larva, pupa, and adult. The eggs are laid on milkweed, which is obligatory for this species, where the pupa or the larva feed on the milkweed. The 3 most common species of milkweed in Pennsylvania are the common milkweed, the butterfly weed, and the swamp milkweed. So by feeding on the milkweed, the butterflies are provided some protection from vertebrate predators such as birds due to the toxin they're ingesting, cardiac glycosides. So while the larvae are obligate feeders on milkweed, the adults are what we call nectar generalists, meaning they will get nectar from many sources, not just milkweed. The first butterflies you're seeing in Pennsylvania, which is as early as mid-April, are the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of those who overwintered in Mexico. This is a 2 to 3 generation return trip. In the summer, you will have a couple of non-migratory generations before the super generation halts reproduction and begins the return trip to Mexico in the winter. So no individual makes the full round trip. We have the ability to influence what I've highlighted here, the first 3 factors that led to the decline of the species. We can plant more milkweed, we can plant more nectar plants, and we can limit our use of insecticide. The eastern population has a goal to add 1.3 billion stems of milkweed by 2038. So it really is going to be all hands on deck to get this species numbers to start coming back up. 20 states, including Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland, have agreed to participate in this effort. So how can you contribute? Start by asking yourself these questions. What resources are available in my area? That doesn't just mean your yard. Do you live near a park? Do your neighbors have milkweed or nectar sources available? And it's really important to try to stick to the native species of milkweed, the native nectar sources. These butterflies have adapted to the native species. So adding the exotic species, for one, as Cass talked about, the extreme genetic manipulation that have gone on with some of the non-natives, the pollen and the nectar is just not as nutritious for our native pollinators. Another reason is, they've evolved with the milkweed and they absolutely need native milkweed. And also ensure that timing is correct for the species. You should try to have nectar sources available from early April through October to ensure the early arrival butterflies and also the ones that are late to leave to Mexico have something to fuel up when they first arrive here and right before they leave to overwinter. This slide and the following slides have wonderful resources for finding and procuring nectar and milkweed seeds and plants. This one is specific to determining what milkweed is native to your area. I have starred the most commonly used ones in our area. One thing to note, the common milkweed, while it is easy to come to find the seeds and the plants, it grows really tall and it spreads really rapidly. So if you have a really tiny space, it might not be the species that you want to plant. You might want to stick to the butterfly or even the swamp milkweed. These 3 sites have so many wonderful resources for selecting and finding milkweed native in your area, for learning about monarchs and other pollinators, and to learn how to get involved in conservation. Xerces has some great seed mixes. Monarch Joint Venture has many resources, including fact sheets, resources for finding nurseries, and Monarch Watch has information on purchasing milkweed, applying for free milkweed seeds or plugs. This resource helps you find local suppliers of native neonicotinoid-free plants and/or seeds. You can search by zip code or you can zoom in. And there's also a way for a vendor to apply to be added to this site. This site allows you to search by zip code to find plants native to your area, or you can look at native butterflies in your area and it will let you know which species of host plant to add in order to attract those different butterflies. Xerces has wonderful guides. Cass showed this one, I believe, per region with suggested nectar plants to have available per season. I encourage you to download these resources when planning your spaces. These guides provide management recommendations for monarch habitat, such as the timing and frequency of mowing. So rest assured that planting for monarchs is not single species management. You will be providing habitat for many other insects and pollinators, such as bees. You may start to see some pests arrive. Just remember that these species have interacted for millennia and nature tends to find a balance. Also, we do not recommend using insecticides, even if you come across aphids. But if you do feel the pests are affecting the plants, you may want to water the plants to ensure they're able to tolerate the aphid feeding. Also, it's probably best not to fertilize the milkweed, as aphids may reproduce more quickly on plants that have high nitrogen concentrations. But if you feel the populations are affecting the plants and becoming too dense, the safest thing to do is just to use your fingers to remove the aphids and squish them. You can use a wet paper towel if you're more comfortable with doing it that way. But you do need to be really careful that you're not removing monarch eggs or larvae because the eggs are really tiny. Luckily, I have a son that's really good at spotting eggs, so he'll come and run and get me when he finds the first egg of the season. And the first caterpillars to hatch are really small. They're really hard to see. Lastly, I just want to point out that our agency has a program called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife that works with various non-federal partners on all kinds of projects for native wildlife species, including pollinators. So this is just an example of one of their pollinator plots that they planned and actually did the work to plant on this site. Here's another example, a fallow field turned into a beautiful wildflower area, and they also plant trees in corridors and can do basically anything for native species. So at this point, I can take questions.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate you highlighting this highly visible species that we all have probably seen in our area. We're going to open it up to questions for all. And I do recognize it is 1 o'clock for those of you who have to head out. That is all right. But what I'd like to do right now is, as you guys are thinking of more questions and adding them to the chat, I'm going to go back and revisit some of those that we had earlier so that we can address them in the recording. At the same time, I'm going to be sharing the contact information for each of our presenters. Hopefully you are now seeing that on your screen. And let's go back to those questions at this point. This can go out to anyone, but I believe it came up when Cass was presenting. Is it okay to attract native pollinator species to an area where beehives are tended by a landowner?
Would you like me to jump in and say that out loud? The
Yeah,
response there?
if you don't mind, that way we've got it in the recording.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, generally, yes. The best way to think about any competition between honeybees or any concern for possible disease spillover, which are possibilities for sure, is to have really abundant pollinator resources. And so having a lot of different flowers and lots of different resources available is the best way to support them. So if there's a really high kind of maybe commercial concentration of hives, maybe don't put your rare flowers there to attract your wild bees, but at the scale of a backyard beekeeper, at the scale of a couple hives on a farm, absolutely enhance all of those floral and nesting resources in the area, and I think better to think about it as the more the better.
Thanks. Next question. Is it okay to use a weed fabric liner and several inches of mulch, or should we leave access to the soil itself for pollinators?
Yeah, great question. So again, solitary ground nesting bees, super gentle, they do generally need access to bare soil in order to nest. Sometimes, you're trying to establish some great flowering trees and shrubs or some new habitat, and mulch or landscape fabric are the only way to keep pest pressure down during that establishment. Maybe in that sense, just think about types of mulches or ground covers that you can allow to decompose in place, or to remove that landscape fabric when you can. But yeah, if you have the choice, try to leave some bare soil and those spaces for habitat. Yep, great question.
Thanks, Cass. The only other question that I see at this point regards the contact information for the speakers that is on screen now. Another quick reminder, you will all receive a follow-up email that contains the slides and a link to the recording when that is posted. We're going to wrap this up with any final thoughts from any of our presenters. All right, hearing none, thank you all for attending, and this concludes our presentation.